Part 3. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I'll stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists, arms, neck, and hair. Every time she bit through a string and let a balloon fly away, the pull got less and less, and her rate of climb slowed down. When she'd bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. Still, she stayed in the air. But she bit through one more string, and then very, very, very slowly began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. Now she began to come absolutely straight back down again. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinarily old woman in the sky. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet." Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer and he looked up, and he gaped and he gasped and he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth as he said, "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating right down on top of him. She was purple with rage, and she was slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to the whole time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll nash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with a stick and cracking him all over his body. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house, it looks like a prison, and not a window anywhere. "Who wants windows?" Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. "Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?" It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. And there's the house, and there's the garden. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep out nasty, nosy little children." Near the house you can see Mr. Twit's workshed. To one side there is the big dead tree. It never has any leaves on, because it's dead. And not far from the tree you can see the monkey cage. There were 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit, but you'll hear about them later. Once a week, on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds, and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before the bird pie day, he would put the ladder up against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug-Tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. And as the sun went down, the birds would fly in from all directions, just to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, the poor things, that the branches were all smeared with glue, Hug-Tight. The moment they landed on the branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was bird pie day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. Didn't matter what kind they were: song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. And there's the pie with all the little feet sticking out. On one Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hug-Tight, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and stinging nettles, not when there were monkeys to look at. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden. Oh no! After a while, they'd explored further around the garden and found the ladder leaning against the big dead tree. They decided to climb up just for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the seats of their pants to the branches. There were no birds, because the presence of the boys had scared them all away. Mr. Twit was furious. As there were no birds for my pie tonight, it'll have to be boys instead. And he climbed up the ladder. Boy pie might be better than bird pie, he went on, grinning horribly. More meat and not so many tiny little bones. The boys were terrified. He's going to boil us, cried one of them. He'll stew us alive, cried the second one. He'll cook us with carrots, cried the third. But the fourth little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, Listen, I've just had an idea. We're only stuck by the seats of our pants, so quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground. Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to make a grab for the nearest boy when all suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran for home with their naked bottoms winking in the sun, leaving nothing but pants behind on the tree. That don't look like it's going to be a very good meal. Now, for the monkeys. The 4 monkeys in the cage in the garden were all one family. They were Mugglewump and his wife and their 2 small children. But what on earth were Mr. and Mrs. Twit doing with monkeys in their garden? Well, in the old days, they had both worked in a circus as monkey trainers. They used to teach monkeys to do tricks and to dress up in human clothes and smoke pipes and all that nonsense. Today, although they were retired, Mr. Twit still wanted to train monkeys. It was his dream that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world. And that meant the monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down on their hands with their feet in the air. They had to play football upside down. They had to balance one on top of the other upside down, with Mugglewump at the bottom and his smallest baby monkey at the very top. They even had to eat and drink upside down, and that was not an easy thing to do because the food and water has to go up your throat instead of down it. Which is in fact almost impossible, but the monkeys simply had to do it, otherwise they got nothing. All this sounds pretty silly to you and me. It sounded pretty silly to the monkeys too. They absolutely hated having to do this upside down nonsense day after day. It made them so giddy standing on their heads for hours on end. Sometimes the 2 small monkey children would faint with so much blood going into their heads. But Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept them practicing for 6 hours a day, every day, and if they didn't do as they were told, Mrs. Twit would come running with a beastly walking stick. Mugglewump and his family longed to escape from the cage in Mr. Twit's garden and go back to the African jungle where they came from. They hated Mr. and Mrs. Twit for making their life so miserable. They had hated them for what they did to the birds every Tuesday and Wednesday. Fly away, birds, they used to shout, jumping around in the cage and waving their arms. Don't sit on that big dead tree. It's just been smeared all over with glue. No, go sit somewhere else. Run. But these were English birds, and they couldn't understand the weird language these monkeys spoke. So they took no notice and went on using the big dead tree and getting caught for Mrs. Twit's bird pie. Then, one day, a truly magnificent bird flew out of the sky and landed on the monkey cage. Good heavens, cried all the monkeys together. It's the roly-poly bird! What on earth are you doing over here in England, roly-poly bird? Like the monkeys, the roly-poly bird came from Africa, and he spoke the same language they did. I come for a holiday, said the roly-poly bird. I like to travel. He fluffed his marvellous coloured feathers and looked down rather grandly at the monkeys. For most people, he went on, flying away on holiday is very expensive, but I can fly anywhere in the world for nothing. Do you know how to talk to these English birds? Mugglewump asked him. Oh, well, of course I do. It's no good going to a country and not knowing the language. Well then, we must hurry, said Mugglewump. Today is Tuesday, and over there you can already see revolting Mrs. Twit, Mr. Twit, putting that ladder up, painting sticky glue all over the branches of the big dead tree, and this evening, when all the birds come to roost, they're going to get stuck and then they're going to get put in the bird pie. So, that evening, the roly-poly bird flew around and round the dead tree, singing out, There's sticky stuff over the tree. If you land in the branches, you'll never get free. So fly, fly, fly away, stay up high, or you'll end up tomorrow in a hot bird pie. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket to snatch all the birds from the big dead tree, there wasn't a single one on it. They were all sitting on top of that monkey cage. The roly-poly bird was there as well, and Mugglewump and his family. They were all inside the cage, and the whole lot of them were laughing at Mr. Twit. Ha, we all got one over on you, you little muppet. And we will be back for the last part.